tonight's webinar, we're going to do a little bit of catch up, talk about some of the advancements we've made in the last month or so. Hoping all you guys had a really nice winter break and are getting back into the swing of things and thinking about getting the curriculum all set up. Then Trevor and I are also going to talk about sort of how the Climate Lab came to be and how our data collection here at Manomet relates to the data collection that all the students are going to be doing. And then we'll open up the floor for questions if you have any. So we'll just jump right in here. So there are some new additions to the website. If you haven't visited, we suggest you guys check it out. We have a brand new functionality on the landing page, which we'll be updating as frequently as we possibly can with different advancements. So we've got our newest newsletter up there. We've also created a video page as well. So we have a lot of our YouTube videos linked in there, but we also have a link to our YouTube channel as well. So we can you can get over to that as well and check out all the videos. So definitely check back at the website every once in a while because we're going to be adding new things. One of the most recent updates is that we now have freshly formatted versions of the curriculum, the short curriculum, the 5-day curriculum. So we'll be putting that up in the next day or so. So be sure to check the materials and resources tab there, and you'll be able to get a fresh set of curriculum if you don't have it already. And this is what our YouTube channel looks like right here. So if you go visit it, you can see that we have our webinars up there as well as several tutorial videos that you guys can check out and get a little refresher on how to, or if you haven't done it before, get a good visual as to what the protocols are. So that being said, I guess we're going to dive right into a little bit of our background here at Manomet.
All right. Thank you, Evan. This is Trevor Lloyd Evans. And I came to Manomet in 1972, but our founders, the people who started the very first part of the bird banding operation, started as early as 1966. And the difference then would have been that the new house you see in the foreground didn't exist. There was only the old house. And the old house probably had something like a 30-foot lawn, and now it's got maybe a 10-foot lawn because we live on eroding bluffs on the edge of Cape Cod Bay. But that, from our bird point of view, is a wonderful thing because migrants concentrate along the coast. And so a lot of Manomet's bird work, especially in land birds, has really concentrated on spring and fall migration and collecting standardized data from a large series of 50 mist nets. Each one is 12 meters long, 2.6 meters high. I'll translate that for you, 39 feet long, 7.5 feet high. And they're in the same locations year after year. During the spring and fall migrations, we take them down in the middle of the summer, and so that the birds can breed happily without interference and falling into a net. And that information that we get from birds that fly into the mist nets, very fine nets that they can't see, has been the basis of our work. Let's go click. And here we go. So here we actually have some rather more mature than middle-aged students, I guess, but they're going around with one of our staff. And in the foreground, you'll see our bander holding a tufted titmouse, sort of bird we can see at our feeders nowadays through the winter. That is a southern species that within the last, I suppose I should now say 75 years, has come into New England and was actually very rare before that. So a southern species that has expanded northwards and is now really pretty common and has adapted well to our mixed coniferous deciduous forest and loves gardens. And you can see the mist net itself has a very fine layer of netting in front of the students' faces there. And so the bird did not see the net, flew in. There are a number of tight panels, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 tight panel strings running longitudinally along the net, and then a bag of netting, which you can see in front of the guy with the black shirt there. And so the bird flies into the net, is very surprised, and drops into the pocket. And then our staff take the bird out, put him into a bag, and take him home. Home is the banding lab, which is in the old house at Manomet. And I believe this is the old laundry, which has now been repurposed into a spanking new state-of-the-art banding lab in 1966. And it turns out to be just about the right size, actually. You can get 3 or 4 banders banding at the bench. You can see up against the back wall. There is a vast amount of literature, most of which has been photocopied and pinned onto the wall for easy access so that you can see what it is you're looking at. And as the bird data are all collected, then they're collected on the computer in front, and I can see somebody called Laura sitting at the computer. Where are the birds, you ask? The birds are in the bags. So we take out a large number of very fine cloth bags with us as we go around the nets, the 50 mist nets, on a regular basis. We do this from dawn to dusk, 5 days a week during the migration period. That's Monday through Friday, both spring and fall. And each bird gets his individual bag. This operates sort of on the technique of if you have a budgerigar or a cage bird, I at least put a cloth over my budgies at night, and that keeps them quiet, and they quieten down immediately. The light level drops, and so birds in bags, in thin linen cloth bags, do the same thing. They stay very quietly. We loop the loop around the top of each bag. There's a bird down inside. We take extreme efforts not to loop the knot around the bird, which is busy trying to scramble up to the top. And then they line up on the hooks down below the banding deck, and the banding bench, I should say. And then we're ready to go. So each one can be taken out individually. This whole process of going around the nets and coming back probably takes, we'd have groups going in both directions. So this would probably take about half an hour maybe, with the groups meeting up and coming back, and then the bird goes up on the hook, and processing one bird without stopping and talking about it probably takes 1 minute. So here are 3 of our staff. The bird comes out of the bag. We put on one of a series of US Fish and Wildlife aluminum bird bands onto the tarsus. That's the lower part of the leg. There it is. Thank you, Evan. There's a very nice little red arrow pointing right at the tarsus. And this is a rather spectacular adult plumage red-shouldered hawk, which my assistant Megan is staring at. And we're looking at the key for aging and sexing techniques and all the things you can do in the hand when you have the bird up close and personal. And with Megan, that's very up close and personal. She's got a good grip. But the band on the tarsus there, the little aluminum band, very light for the bird, sort of the equivalent of maybe 1.5 wristwatches, has an individual number, as well as the Fish and Wildlife address, so that it says inform Fish and Wildlife, Washington, D.C., USA, or on some of the more modern bands, it has 1-800-327-BAND, and all of the data that we collect and that we record in our computer is sent to the banding office, which is a federal North American banding office in Washington, D.C. So it's Canadian and US at the moment, and we're hoping to pull in the Mexicans in the not too distant future. So it really will be a North American banding office. And we tell, obviously, the feds what species the band was put on, the time, the age, the sex, the wing, the weight, and a lot of other information that we have, which is right here. Evan always chuckles when he sees that we have a, what is it, a Gateway 2000. I still think this is the peak of computer evolution. But the other nice thing about this computer is it doesn't let you do anything like go on the internet. It's merely data entry. And so for an individual bird, just quickly to run through it without killing us with details, that band number 223154768 was put on a gray catbird on the 9th of, June in 2007. And the bander was Megan, and the wing chord, which we measure as an indication of the size of the bird, was 87 millimeters. It did not show any subcutaneous fat on the underparts. We blow and look. Birds often have transparent skin. You can see that. It was not in breeding condition. Cloaca protuberance, brood patch, no. Had a little bit of body molt, and we code all of this information, and our staff and our volunteers are quite skilled at this. In fact, it was molting so much that we couldn't look through the transparent skin and look at the degree of scarification, but we often can do that. And then the result of looking at the keys was that this bird was hatched in this particular year, and we can tell by the eye color and by the mouth color The sex is unknown. It came out of actually net 50 out of 50, and it weighed 39.5 grams. We have the time, and we have a few other codes that aren't particularly relevant. Let's jump. Here comes the really exciting part, at least from the bird's point of view. So we collect all of the data that we just talked about in rather less time than it took to talk about it. We therefore have 380-something thousand records of spring and fall migrants, initial captures, and repeat captures of the same birds in some instances since 1966. And that has been the database on which we have been basing our long-term studies. And you can see some students from one of the local schools having a fun time watching the bird fly away. This really is the fun part. Evan would want us to point out that this is a yellow-breasted chat, a beautiful warbler.
It's a great bird.
Great bird.
Oh,
great
yeah.
bird. We all like yellow-breasted chats.
Yeah.
It's a big warbler.
Yeah.
When we start thinking about, we put bans on birds, and isn't it fun? And we give the data to the feds, and it's available for everyone to use, of course, and all that sort of good stuff. But it's always a good idea to stop from time to time and say, why are we doing this? So we'll stop and say, why do we ban birds? Because each band has an individual number there. And if we recapture the bird, or actually if anyone else recaptures the bird, that might be another bander in Canada or in Central or South America or in Maryland or just down the road in southern Massachusetts, then they would read the band number and they would report back to the banding office. And then they would hear from the banding office where and when we banded it, and we would hear from the banding office where and when they found the bird. Also, we have the time period. So the first piece of information that we can easily get here is that we can estimate how long the birds live. Birds don't live a tremendously long time, especially the land birds, the passerine species that we catch so many. But there are records, and I think the oldest bird, we always do this with school groups and adult groups and all sorts of groups, somebody is guaranteed to ask, what's your oldest bird? So we try to forestall this as quickly as we can. And our oldest bird, I think, is actually an Arctic tern, yes. And the Arctic tern, which is a small gull-like tern that lived on the end of Plymouth Beach, was banded by an older bander down there. And we picked that bird up 26 years later. So for 26 years, that bird had been breeding on Plymouth Beach. And since it's an Arctic tern, we know that during the fall migration, it flies down the coast of eastern coast of North America, across the Caribbean, all the way down the coast of South America, and winters off the southern tip of South America, and sometimes as far south as the Antarctic Peninsula. So this bird had traveled well over 250,000 miles just in commuting, never mind about flying around and feeding. As we have our banded birds, and if again they are recaptured, then we will learn eventually as the data build up, where is that particular species breeding during the breeding season? Where is it during the non-breeding season? As far as we northerners are concerned, we call that winter. So where does the bird spend its winter when it's not here, if it's a migratory species? And from captures and sometimes tragedies, cats, windows, you name it, run into a car along the route, we may find migration routes of our banded birds. So this is the basic information when you open your field guide and it says the bird breeds here up in the north, and it winters down there in Central America, and it flies down the east coast and scoots across the Caribbean. That information comes from a very large number of banders, including us, over many, many years. For pretty much 100 years now, banding has been going on. And that's how we get that information. Another thing we can do is that we know how many individuals are passing through. If you imagine that I was trying to estimate populations of migrant birds by just counting, which is a fine way to do it, I could go out in the morning and see 10 American robins, and I could go out the next morning and see 10 American robins. Are they the same? We don't know. All robins look alike as far as I'm concerned. We might tell a bright male from a duller female, but you can't tell one robin from another. So with our standardized banding and capturing the birds in the nets, we know precisely who they are, and so we will be able to get a much more precise estimate of the numbers of these birds over time, given that each time it's a sample. Some birds fly over the nets, some birds escape through the nets, some big birds bounce out, but the likelihood of that happening year after year after year is probably equal. And so we can document population changes, and in some cases range expansions northwards into our area, and in some cases contractions as birds that were present 20, 30, 40, in our case just about 50 years ago, might be less abundant now. And then finally, there are changes in migration timing. We weigh the birds, so we can look at weight gains, we can look at age ratios, and essentially, since birds, again, coming back to our theme, are such good environmental indicators, we use them as indicators of their adaptation to environmental change. And the general supposition is that birds, because they have wings and because they vote with their wings, are able to move if they don't like the environmental change. Then they're going to be much better than whatever you might choose as your favorite animal. Earthworms, for example, or rhododendrons, which really can't move if they don't like the environment. Brian, what are some that are less abundant? Thank you, Brian. Yeah, that would be a long list. How long do we have? Some of the less abundant species, sadly, are some of the ones that we all love so much, and these would be many of the long-distance migrant warblers. So long-distance migrants, warblers, tanagers, some of the thrushes, some of the prettier birds that we're all so excited to see in the spring, and they breed here or north of here and then head south to wintering areas that in many cases are in Central and South America. And these birds are suffering from habitat loss and possibly a number of other factors. But generally speaking, those birds, and particularly from recent Canadian studies, aerial insectivores. In other words, birds that catch insects mostly on the wing. So birds like tree swallows and flycatchers and the American redstart, which is a little warbler that does that. Those sorts of species, whippoorwills at night, which tend to feed on large white moths that they can see at night, or chuck-will's widows, or any of those nocturnal species, are showing some of the greatest declines. And there are many theories about that. It started off with DDT, and now everyone is talking about neonicotinoids as seed dressings. But the number of insects has undoubtedly decreased. And again, birds are indicating this, and some of the less abundant birds, unfortunately, are those sorts of species. Let's jump on to the next picture, and we talked about bird recoveries. So this is a map that we use very frequently in all our presentations. It's an old and rather battered map, and we really are going to get a nice updated computer version of it. But for the time being, looking at that map of North America, there are actually about 400 and something red and green pins in there. Don't worry too much about them. But the story seems to be that all of those birds that were handled at Manomet in Massachusetts, up there in Cape Cod, either moved northwards up the coast or southwards down the coast. And of all the species we handle, most of them are on the eastern flyway, and you can see banding recoveries. In other words, somebody found our bird all the way down the east coast into Texas, up in Missouri, and down through Florida, and down through the Caribbean islands, and a cluster of particularly small shorebirds from the beaches down below Manomet end up in Suriname and Guyana and French Guiana. And a few of the bigger shorebirds, like ruddy turnstones and red knots, go all the way down to southern Brazil, Lagoa de Peixe on the very southern edge of Brazil there. And we even have some red dots down into Argentina and as far south as Tierra del Fuego. So some of these birds are migrating incredibly long distances. And the shorebirds we just mentioned are probably breeding in Arctic Canada and Alaska. So this is an indication and a nice visual of where do the birds go, why do we ban birds. We collect a lot of data, and I threw in a random piece of data. Let's not get too excited about it. But since we weigh our birds very carefully, we put them in a little cone and weigh them on a digital balance. And so one of the advantages we have here is that when we look at one particular bird, this is a warbler, the black-polled warbler during fall migration. And from 1966 through the fall of 2011, we have over 7,700 records of individual weights of black-polled warblers. And you can just see a number on the y-axis and the weight in grams to the nearest half gram, I think it is, on the x-axis. So a nice normally distributed curve of weight from rather light birds in the 9-10 grams. That bird probably has no fat at all, up through the average bird, which is around about 12 grams-ish. And then some fatter birds down to 13, 14, 15 grams. And then the very fat birds. And those very fat birds we find stay longer at Manomet. We often recapture them a number of times. And each time we recapture them in the fall, if all is going well, they're putting on more and more weight. So here is a bird that might have a fat-free weight of around 10 grams. And we do catch a number of them as much as 20 or more grams. They have literally doubled their weight. And all of that is fuel for fall migration. So this is one of the exceptional species that takes off from places like New England and flies non-stop all the way down to the north coast of South America. So just an example of some of the data that we can pull out. Then we started thinking, well, look at all this data. We have 50 years of data. What are we finding? What sort of findings can we have that relate to some of the big changes, and especially climate change? And quite frankly, in 1966, or even when I arrived here in 1972, climate change was not big. Climate change was something you noticed if you drove north or south, but now it's catching up with all of us. So here again is another species, the northern cardinal. And northern cardinals, rather like the tufted titmouse, was a southern species 75 years, even 100 years ago. And here we are looking at some of the data from Manomet, which actually we have adapted for the curriculum. So back in 1969, there were 102 cardinals found during the whole fall. And here are data from 1969 through 2015, so we updated it for you. And these are the number of birds banded, corrected for the number of hours the nets are open. So we're being very careful about making sure that if we had more nets open one day and fewer nets open another day because of wind or something like that, then we made those corrections. And starting from just 1 or 2 cardinals back in 1970-ish, then we're up to 2014, we had 98 cardinals, I think, during the fall. And so that shows rather dramatically the increase in a species that was formerly a southern species found from Florida all the way up to about New Jersey, and then a few into New York, and now they're all the way through New England and up even into the Gulf of St. Lawrence. A non-migrant bird, not a migrant, like the black-poll warbler. And so this species stays, and once it's arrived, then it's going to stay through the winter. And they have adapted to some extent to humans, and to some extent they're lucky, because humans tend to cut down the eastern forest and replace it with houses, which cardinals really like, and then have gardens and house lots that have lots of bushes, which cardinals really love to nest in, and preferably with berries and seeds, which cardinals love to eat in the winter. And then to make life just perfect, something like 40% of people in North America say they are interested in birds to some extent, and very often that extent is putting out bird feeders. So I'm sure you have all seen cardinals feasting on black oil sunflower seed in your feeder. So perhaps that one storm that would have wiped out cardinals, and that's why they didn't come this far north, now they can get through. But again, with a whole suite of species, including birds that do not like people and do not like gardens and do not eat sunflower seeds, mockingbirds would be one example. A lot of those southern species are now pushing northwards. So a good example, which we will get.
So folks are wondering why there's so much fluctuation in the number of cardinals year to year.
There's a lot of fluctuation in the number of young produced year to year, and that would certainly be very important. The average adult songbird probably only lives on average 1 year, 2 years at most. And of the young produced in any 1 year, probably 50%, 60%, 70% don't make it through till the following year to breed. Then secondly, severe winters certainly have an effect. And if you notice from 2014 to 2015, the last 2 bars on the chart there was a considerable drop in cardinals. And that was winter weather. So winter weather can be tough. Any reason why some years are low, like 2009? 2009, I don't know that the winter of 2008 and 2009 was particularly severe. And really, the answer is that if you want to see a trend, then you can't just look at any 5-year period or even a 10-year period like 1979 through 1989. Manomet and Turk, Brown Evan and I have talked about this particular example. And during that period from the 70s up to about 90, the population goes up and down, but probably doesn't have a statistically significant increase. But as you can look back over 20 years or 30 years, or in our case from 1969 through 2015, then you get at the underlying trends. And that has really been the basis of a lot of our information. Yeah, do we have any theories? We have too many theories. The question is always which particular theory is driving what particular change. Let's jump on that into the next guy here. And again, a popular favorite, blue jays. Unless you happen to be a cardinal, because I'm sure blue jays are particularly good at stealing cardinal eggs and young, along with lots of other songbird eggs. They are rapacious. They will eat pretty much everything. And looking at our long-term data on blue jays, we used this for another approach. And the approach here was, let's look at the median date, in other words, the average date of spring arrival. And in this case, we're looking at arrival of migrant blue jays coming back in the spring. They are a migrant. There are plenty of them moving. You probably have one or two who live in your backyard all the time, and so do we. And we have their bands on, and we know who they are. But the majority of blue jays migrate south in the spring, and we certainly get a good, north in the spring, and a larger number because of all the young migrating south in the fall. And so again, we have some decades here. So all we did was look at the median, the average, the middle, the mean. If you have a big enough sample, your median and your mean are going to be about the same anyway. And we just looked at the average date, the date at which half the population came before that date and half the population came after that date during the spring. And we lumped the data together. So instead of having a lot of ups and downs as we did in cardinals, we are now looking at decadal changes. So the bottom bar from 1970 through 1979, the average blue jay came by on the 16th of May. And looking at the next decade up there, the 80s, 14th of May, the 90s, 12th of May, the early aughts, the 8th of May, and just the last 6 years, I guess, the 5th of May. So here's a species that is arriving back earlier and earlier, and showing a very strong correlation with warming climate and warming climate over those years. And that, of course, is one of our stories. It's true of a lot of species. The advantage is that we can handle as many as 70 to 90 different species of birds, not huge samples of all of them, but certainly enough that we can look at a range of birds and look at birds that winter in one area or breed in another area, or migrate to Central America or migrate to South America. And white-throated sparrows are a winter resident here. They don't breed here, they breed further north. And our long-term data, looking again at the spring, we have found that white-throated sparrows, on average, are arriving a day earlier per degree centigrade of warming in the spring. And again, only showing up because we're able to look back from 1969 through 2015. We'll quickly pull it together in a couple of pictures, and I promise not to do very much here that will cause you too much pain. But now we're looking at a range of species. So again, we are looking at spring arrival dates and the responses of birds to warmer years between 1970 and 2002. So we are not comparing the date that the average bird arrives back per year from 70 up through 2002. We're comparing it with the warmth of that spring as calculated from a number of temperature gauges. And in fact, we even published a paper, I notice up there. Oh yes, 2008, here we go. In Global Change Biology, no less. And so here are some interesting little things scattered around. So on the x-axis, we have the dates. This is the date in spring that, on average, the species comes back. And each of those little four-letter codes, either blue, green, or red, are different species of birds that we have large samples. And if you look on the y-axis, you will see a 0. And the bottom line here is that if the species is positioned below the 0 line, then birds are coming back earlier over that period from 1970 through 2002. And if they're coming back above that 0 line, then they're arriving back a little bit later. Although realistically, I suspect from -50 to +50 either side of that, there's no statistical significance. So let's just jump on and give you an idea of exactly what sort of groupings we're talking about. Evan has put a very nice blue circle around a group of birds there, which you notice are the ones that are coming back that much earlier over this period. And don't worry about the four-letter codes, but it includes birds that many of us know, like blue jays and eastern or rufous-sided towhees and chickadees and white-throated sparrows, robins, birds we've talked about already. And the thing that all of these dark blue birds have in common is that they winter within North America, largely to the south of New England. Let's click again, and we find a group of green birds. What do the green birds do? Well, again, our theme here is wintering. And so those include a number of, I think, a couple of flycatchers, but the majority of these are warblers and a thrush, the wood thrush. And all of these species, Baltimore oriole is another one, breed here or north of here and winter in either the Central American countries or in the Caribbean islands, or perhaps in a very few places right along the Gulf or the southern tip of Florida. But basically Central American and Caribbean wintering birds. And finally, the red circles. And the red circles are the real long-distance birds. These are the birds that fly all the way to South America. And they include some thrushes and some warblers and some flycatchers. And notice the red birds are not showing any difference. How do they know down there at the Amazon that it's going to be a warmer year? Answer seems to be they don't. As opposed to a blue jay who is wintering in Maryland and finds that it's a warmer spring and is quite capable of reacting, in other words, acting as an indicator of what many populations of things are doing, but birds are really good indicators. And so coming back earlier and responding in warmer years by coming back earlier. The next picture. Somebody always asks, and we always debate whether to put it in, so all right, what happened in fall? Same story. But during the fall migration here, again, all the birds above the 0 line in fall, and that includes birds like white-throated sparrows that winter in North America, and it includes common yellowthroats and Wilson's warblers and other warblers that winter in Central America, and it also includes some birds that winter down in South America, like red-eyed vireos, black-polled warblers. So a whole range of birds, not the same thing. In fall, they are mostly, but not all, arriving back a little earlier and trending that during warmer years. They seem to be able to stay longer, and so you notice that all the blue species here are arriving back later on their fall migration at Manomet. And so what they are doing there, quite pretty, oh thank you, what they are doing then is having a chance to have perhaps a second brood if their first brood fails, or even getting 2 successful broods. So not necessarily all bad. As long as the food resources hold out and as long as the berries are ripe long enough for fall migration fuel, then some of those are staying later. But down below the line, 3 species, TUTI, BCCH, DOWO. If you're good, you can guess. DO for downy, WO for woodpecker, black-capped chickadee, tufted titmouse. 3 species that winter within North America, but they all nest in holes. And so much as they may or may not wish to take longer to have another brood, that is not in their genes. These are single-brooded birds, obligate single-brooded, and they have, in an evolutionary sense, chosen to have a single brood in a cavity in a tree or in a birdhouse, which is really a cavity in a tree, or a cavity in a fence post, or a drain, or something that looks like a cavity in a tree. And because the young are protected there, then they are much slower to mature. And so they concentrate on getting off one brood, and so are not adapting to longer fall migration. But really, that's the bird stuff. The bird stuff is interesting. We write the odd paper, we discover the trends, we try to be monitors. We try to make the point that birds are great environmental indicators, but who are we making it to? Mr. Evan.
Right, so thank you, Trevor. Trevor just did a fabulous job going through the types of questions that we can answer with longitudinal data that we have. But as he said, we may share it in the occasional scientific paper, but science is not too helpful if it's performed in a vacuum. So we really enjoy sharing what we've learned through the years and what we continue to learn with visitors to the banding lab. Here we have a picture of the bench outside of our banding lab with Alex Bander there educating some folks, some very curious children with lots of questions. It's always difficult to get to all the questions. But throughout the years, we've had many visiting school groups, including some schools that are included in the Climate Lab as well. We also have visiting family groups too. But the main problem with these programs is that we're limited by the number of visitors that we can have. And also, as Trevor said, we're only banding in the spring and in the fall.
Not even on wet days.
And that's true. Not in the rain or heavy wind either. Yeah. So the question is, how can we sort of expand our reach a little bit more? So it would be great if the public could study birds, and in a lot of ways there are some citizen science initiatives that allow people to study birds, but not really to the extent that we're doing. Most people don't have banding permits or mist nets and lots of free time to go out and band migrant birds. So we thought that it might be pretty good to try to tie plants into this as well. Plants are accessible, they're everywhere. It's great that they don't move, and they're also incredible bioindicators. So when we were coming up with the ideas for, I guess, the pilot of Climate Lab, plants really became our main focal species, or main focal, I guess, kingdom. It's also important to note that plants are actually very connected to birds, particularly in the spring. So birds actually are coming back in the spring just in time to nibble down on all of these little caterpillars here. So what we have here is a cerulean warbler, which is a very long distance migrant. It's spending its winters down in Central and Northern South America, and coming back every single year. And this is an example of a neotropical migrant, which are birds that migrate down there, that's really seen some sharp declines in the last 40 or 50 years. We actually ended up catching one in the spring.
In the spring, very exciting.
Yeah, it was the first time we'd caught one in, I don't know, over 20 years.
The banding lab actually wrote back to us and said, "Are you sure it was a cerulean warbler? There has not been one banded in Massachusetts since 2002. So, yes, we're right at the northern end of the range.
Yeah, they're more of a interior sort of southern mixed woodland species, and that habitat is really vanishing throughout most of its range. Not to mention what's happening in all the stopover sites and all of its wintering range as well. So it's definitely seen some pretty sharp declines. But one of the things that it really relies on is the caterpillar that's in its mouth. These birds migrating north are using caterpillars as fuel to fuel their journey. Those caterpillars are coming out right when the leaves are nice and fresh, because that's when leaves taste the best. So by measuring plant leaf out, we're actually able to gauge how quickly that's happening, and really sort of maybe even look at some of the synchrony between peaks of leaf emergence and peaks of bird migration. In some cases, in Europe, it's been documented of cases of ecological mismatch, where one species isn't coming back in enough time or at the right time, and they're not actually hitting the peak emergences of most of the insect food that they actually eat. So, these things are actually quite relevant in the world and quite interconnected. So, how do we engage people by measuring plants? We've partnered with Turk, and Turk has actually developed a very strong curriculum that actually uses a lot of Manomet data to make points about climate change. So here we've got a page from our curriculum here that shows some, I guess, spring arrival trends, in this case, of an eastern towhee. So that was a bird that's arriving earlier and earlier. So that's how we're doing that. And then not only do we use the curriculum, but we're also doing field work as well. So we're engaging you guys, the educators, to get out there, start collecting data, and also engage your students as well. So it's all about getting the kids out there, collecting the data. We're holding out pencils in front of our face in order to take scientific measurements. And, these are things that are completely approachable and totally doable. Science isn't some crazy, mysterious thing. It's relevant, and it's very easy to do a lot of these measurements. And I think that that's sort of an aha moment when a lot of these students actually realize that they too can actually collect data out in the field. Brian says, once you're out there, you can look for other possible projects to start up, new organisms and new questions. So yeah, we definitely encourage you guys to get out there and just to look around your study sites. I know some of you have set up study sites with us and some of you haven't. Obviously, there are going to be different organisms at different study sites and different species that are more abundant than others. But definitely keep your eyes peeled, and not only are you able to come up with questions and new ideas, but also make sure that your students are engaged as well with that. So I don't know, did I cover?
Wonderful.